Hello, everyone, and I hope you're enjoying this first conference day, the first day of our National Citizen Leadership Conference. I apologize for my voice, too much talking and too much spring pollen here in New England. But welcome to this breakout. I'm really excited about it. I think it's a place to really bring together both the big reforms and change practices that are going to build the future of America and the people who are getting it done right here. Debilyn, Layla, Cheryl, Scott, nice to see you. Thank you for being with us. Scott, congratulations on the Alaskans for Better Elections big ballot win last November that gave so much hope to Americans around the country. And we were very happy to present you with you and the whole team with our award. And we really appreciate your kind remarks. I remember those early days when you were just getting this started. So It's quite exciting to see how much you did there. And we're going to talk more about that. Everyone, we're going to have a chance to get your questions into the conversation. And let me just say a few words before we introduce our guests. Things seem dark sometimes in America, challenging times, and we do have challenging times. This conversation tonight that we're having right here is going to put it in some historical context and then zero in on what's really happening right now that is really astonishing. If we look back from any vantage point, either up or forward, and look back what's going on right now, it's a much better story. And the historical context for that is it's always been tough to be American. It's always been tough to govern as a free and equal people together. Nobody's ever done it. Certainly nobody's ever done it for 3 centuries. Like we're trying to always get better and better and actually deliver on that great promise. And you look at the patterns of our history and you see them going on right now where almost everything is lost. It's falling apart. We don't believe in ourselves anymore. We're fighting each other. People don't feel represented. It was the revolution. It was the Civil War and the great amendments that came out of that Civil War. It was between the first part of the century after the Gilded Age and the last century and all kinds of challenges. It was the 1960s when cities were burning and we had a very unpopular war, a president driven from office with corruption. But if you look at the other side of the story, every one of those same periods, unheard of advances in constitutional equality, liberty, reforms, constitutional amendments every time, big new innovations, ballot initiatives for one, we mentioned those. That had never happened in America until the turn of the last century when Americans insisted on taking the government back and their voice in it and created the ballot initiative. The primary system, Scott's going to say something about open primaries tonight, but in the 60s and 70s, the American people wrested it from party bosses and said, we're going to have a more open party system. And now we need work again. The great civil rights struggle, still going on today, but advances throughout all of those periods. And so, that's what we're talking about tonight. Yes, it's the full story. It's the hard stuff, the way we're torn apart and divided against each other by some of the forces that are really hurting this country, but how we're uniting to build something really big. So 10 years from now, what is it going to look like when Americans look back and say, what were those big things? What were the amendments? What were the ballot initiatives? What were the voting rights advances? How did Americans start talking to each other again? And legislators working together across partisan lines to represent their constituents. Well, you're going to hear it tonight because the people who are getting that done are right here. So let me introduce them. Cheryl Crawford. Just raise your hand so people can see who you are. There's Cheryl. My friend Cheryl Crawford is on the board of American Promise. And we're so glad to work closely with Cheryl. She is the leader of MassVOTE, the voting rights and voting representation and registration and access to the ballot and all kinds of great work at MassVOTE. She's the second vice president of the NAACP here in Boston. And I know that she is such a champion for all of these efforts that put power in the hands of the people. It's what she's all about. She served on the Women's Pipeline for Change Oversight and Planning Board and the Attorney General's Advisory Council on Racial Justice. Thank you, Cheryl, for being here tonight. Scott Kendall, you saw earlier in the conference, back here tonight, our friend and leader in Alaska for so much reform. And he is not always outside the system reforming it. He works actively in our political system, trying to get the best out of it. He is an Alaskan attorney. He served as counsel and campaign coordinator on Senator Lisa Murkowski's elections in 2010 and 2016 to the U.S. Senate. He then served as chief of staff for Governor Bill Walker in Anchorage in Alaska, and then was the author and leader of Ballot Measure 2, which we're going to talk more about in Alaska. As I said, we were very glad to work with you and the wonderful grassroots team of Alaskans at Alaskans for Better Elections. Scott, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Debilyn Molineaux, my friend at Bridge Alliance and on the board of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers with us and many other leaders. And there are many reforms, and we have a sample here. This is not to say if they are not in this room that they are not also writing the future of America and our political system to represent the people. They are, and virtually all of them are members of Bridge Alliance, which Debilyn leads, and we are proud to be a part of it. So Debilyn co-founded and now leads, as I said, the Bridge Alliance. 90 plus organizations just brought the fulcrum onto the Bridge Alliance platform, a media platform, and she also co-founded National Conversation Project and Living Room Conversations. Debilyn, thank you for being here. And last but certainly not least, and I guess no offense to Cheryl and me, maybe older to the new generation, rising to do things a lot better than we did, and determined to make the way we behave and the way we serve and the way we practice our political system much better. Layla Zaidane, am I saying that right? Zaidane?
Great.
Good. Layla Zaidane is the president and chief executive officer of the Millennial Action Project, a recognized expert on youth engagement, and she represents Millennial Action Project as spokesperson, ambassador, featured in outlets from the Washington Post, New York Times, Forbes, U.S. News World Report, Huffington Post, McClatchy, many others, and named by Fusion in 2016 as one of 30 women under 30 who will change elections in the world and America and everything else. She graduated from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And Layla, congratulations to you as you take the mantle of leadership at Millennial Action Project. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we're going to dive in before I lose my voice entirely, and we'll let these great folks take it over. We've heard a lot about the constitutional amendment that American Promise is working on through the evening, and we'll hear more. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I think people know it will enable us to get a handle on the power of money in our political system and ensure that the states and the people can actually enact some reasonable rules about how money is used so that the voices of the voters and the people are put first. But I just want to say how much progress it's made, and then put that in a quick historical context. And then I'm going to go to Cheryl on some voting rights and other reforms for voting that she's on top of it making happen in Massachusetts and beyond. Scott on the big Alaska win and the set of reforms there. And then we'll pull back from some of the specifics of reforms and drill into other aspects of the work we need to do as a country, from the state legislators who are working in the Millennial Action Project across partisan lines for better politics, and Bridge Alliance's great work on civics, reforms, so many other things. So the historical context of the constitutional amendment is we have never had one of those great amendment or those great reform moments in our history without amendments. So 4 amendments in the night between 1961, 1971, 4 amendments between 1910, 1920, 3 amendments after the Civil War to put the country's new birth of freedom into motion again. So this is the pattern. And we've never had a successful reform movement or amendments that could do it all without a suite of other renewal and reform practices. So this amendment's on its way. We'll talk more about that. But let's dive in to what else is happening. What is this going to look like 10 years from now? Cheryl, let me turn it over to you. Tell us what you're working on with MassVOTE. What are the big initiatives? How are you getting the voters to be heard first?
Yes. Hi. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for having me, Jeff. Thank you to American Promise for this space to have this conversation. But what I think about innovations and reforms and things that are happening, what comes to mind first is like ranked choice voting. Right, ranked choice voting. The reasons why it works. There's many reasons, and one is because it really leads to decreased partisanship. It empowers third-party candidates. It eliminates spoiler candidates, and it ensures that the winner attains majority support. MassVOTE has been working tirelessly over the years, right, to make it more accessible to everyone to be able to vote. Oftentimes, we hear conversations. And this is why I really love ranked choice voting, right? Oftentimes we hear conversations where we're trying to build power and we want people to not run, right? Don't crowd the field. I think one of the best things that ranked choice voting does is it eliminates that whole spoiler candidates thing. At a time when we're asking people to really engage and become involved in democracy, you really don't want to say, don't run, right? Like you want everybody running. Ranked choice voting is used in 17 cities, including San Francisco and Minneapolis, as well as 2 states, Maine and Rhode Island. And although ranked choice voting didn't pass in Massachusetts in 2020, it did pass with heavy majority support and in numerous communities like Boston. A number of the communities in Massachusetts, like Northampton, practiced ranked choice voting in local elections prior to 2020 and will continue to do so. So we're really working to increase the number of communities that practice ranked choice voting in their municipal elections. And additionally, ranked choice voting is only gaining support nationwide. It's not losing it. Last year, for example, Virginia passed House Bill 1103, which allows ranked choice voting to be used in local elections. And I believe it was just yesterday it passed in Austin. So that's pretty exciting. But other things that we're working on outside of the Votes Act, we worked really hard last year to pass the Votes Act. And what that brings to mind is this rapidly rising popularity and polarization of voting by mail. Prior to COVID-19 pandemic, only 5 states seriously practiced voting by mail in each election. But by the 2020 general election, 9 states, including Washington, D.C., automatically mailed voters ballots. 14 more automatically mailed voters by the application. And so there were really only 5 states that required an excuse beyond COVID-19 to vote by mail. So when I think about us moving forward, vote by mail will likely be here to stay. California, for example, transitioned. They transitioned from mailing ballots to those that requested it to mailing ballots to all registered voters during the pandemic. Massachusetts will likely be able to implement a permanent version of vote by mail system. But states like Colorado have long practiced vote by mail, providing just one practical state case study after another on how the policy will work. So despite what some people are saying, that policy has proven safe, convenient, and accessible. That is what we're constantly working on, just ensuring that everybody has the opportunity and the access to vote.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl. Losing my voice again. Fortunately, I don't have to do much more talking than We're going to bring Scott into the conversation now. Really appreciate all your work, Cheryl. We'll talk more about it. Scott, you did something perhaps with Alaskans for better elections that maybe is counterintuitive. You trusted the voters to be able to handle 4 or 5 big reforms all at once. And I think it's certainly our belief in American Promise that Americans know if it's not big enough, you're not answering the problems we have, and Americans can handle the scope of the solutions we need. Tell us about why you took that approach, how it went, what, of course, summarize it first to let us know what the great law that you passed does. But we'd love to have you say a little bit more about the strategy as well.
Yeah. So we started off in a little bit about Alaska, which is sort of where the rest of the country is trending, but 63% of Alaskans don't affiliate with either major party. And yet, like many places, we had a semi-closed primary. So you get the Democratic ballot, you get the Republican ballot. If you're a registered Democrat, you can't vote in the Republican ballot and vice versa. And there was no ballot for most Alaskans who actually wanted to go down and make a decision of who to support in that primary. Maybe they want a Republican for U.S. Senate, but they want a Democrat for U.S. House. That didn't exist. And it actually, in the past, Alaska did have open primaries, and that's something that was changed. So it was a little bit of, that was the problem I was looking to solve. But as I unwound how do open primaries work, I realized, a top 2 system, which some places have, doesn't solve the problem in that now you've got a ton of districts that have 2 Ds or 2 Rs on the ballot. You still don't have that political diversity that most people are seeking, so people aren't going to show up. Mm-hmm. It's not for them. Then we thought about, let's put 3 people through. Well, then you've got the spoiler effect, and you potentially have a person who can get elected with 35% of the vote, that the other 65% of the state wanted someone else or preferred either of the other 2 people to that person. So that created a problem. And it was something I had witnessed firsthand back in 2010 when I worked for Senator Murkowski. She kind of famously lost her Republican primary and she ran as a write-in candidate. And it was only the second time in U.S. history a write-in candidate won, but it was the first time a write-in candidate won actually running against both parties. She had a well-financed Democrat, a well-financed Republican. The only other time it had worked was when a candidate swapped in for a deceased candidate. So, but yet she won, and, she won by 4 or 5%. It wasn't, it certainly was close, but at the same time, it really, Alaska really showed what it could do. But at the same time, we came very close to ending up with a candidate that, again, 65% of the electorate didn't want. So that was sort of the problem, the Gordian knot I was attempting to unwind. And I came across Catherine Gale and Michael Porter's report, Harvard Business School, that talked about how to make elections competitive, how to make them a rational decision-making process. And so I came up with the idea of, started with top 3, but ultimately settled on top 4 nonpartisan primaries. So every single candidate goes on the same ballot, and pick your favorite, and the top 4 vote getters move on to the general. And then we run the general election by ranked choice rules, so you don't get that split that ends up with some extremist candidate winning. And then the last reform we put in was actually a ban on dark money in state elections. We can't get federal elections yet because, the FEC occupies that field, but actually ballot measure 2 did include a value statement saying we want to amend the Constitution to rationally regulate money in our federal election system. So that value statement is actually in the ballot measure. But we banned dark money in our elections for a couple of reasons. First of all, Alaska is a small population state, becomes a dumping ground for lots of money because we got 2 senators like everywhere else. And it can be destructive, deceptive. The other problem we found is in a world where we adopt these measures and we might have 2 Democrats, we might have 2 Republicans, but in a sense, the parties no longer decide your choices. We found it incredibly, incredibly important that the people have the most information they can have about who's trying to influence their vote. And so we've got a ban on dark money, 24-hour reporting requirements for expenditures and donations and independent expenditure groups. So really this was all just voter focused. How do we give the voters the most information and the most tools to make their choice? So really, that was the genesis of it. Predictably late in the game, we had partisan interests on both sides come in and attack us. And, we saw our support go from something like 60% down to 51, 52%. But ultimately, in spite of those things, in spite of, the largest figures in both the Republican and Democratic Party urging a no vote, we still, pulled off a win. And we're seeing a little bit of the fruits of that right now, which is what we hoped for, which is not just change who you elect, but change their incentives so they act different. And so right now, Alaska has a bipartisan majority in its House of Representatives, even though by pure numbers, there are mostly Republicans. There's a clear majority of Republicans. A mix of Republicans, Democrats, and independents have come together for a ruling coalition. And so it's incredibly encouraging that we're already seeing, sort of the dream happen.
That is encouraging indeed. Thank you. We're going to pivot a little bit from specific reforms to big picture civic practices and some work that Layla and Debilyn are both engaged in different ways. Just as we do, though, the people who've joined us, you can join the conversation by submitting comments or questions for our panel. I believe you click on your name, but I think we'll all be able to figure that out. Just type in your comment or question, and we'll bring you into the conversation as well. Debilyn, let's talk about Bridge Alliance. What was your vision? How's it going? What's the piece of the big mosaic, as you like to say, that you're tackling with Bridge Alliance?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and thanks for having us here tonight. Bridge Alliance, our vision is pretty simple. We want a thriving, just, and healthy democracy. And we think of ourselves, I've kind of moved on from mosaic, Jeff, because we kind of think of ourselves now as like stewards of a democracy ecosystem. And like the physical ecosystem, we each need to be aware of our own role and our impact on then a larger whole. And that's the work of Bridge Alliance. So we work with our member organizations to kind of build that awareness into society and throughout society. And our members, like American Promise and other supporters, have grown to be a healthy community of their own. So we start modeling that which we want to see in society. The community includes reformers. It includes civic engagement advocates and people who work on the dialogue sphere. It includes those who serve our elected officials so that we can have better policy. And all of these are like elements within a democracy ecosystem that need to be nurtured and cared for so they remain healthy and we don't let the toxins take over. We at Bridge Alliance do this with several larger projects, infrastructure for this democracy ecosystem, if you will. The first one that I just have to say out loud is not a project, it's a way of doing business, it's an operating system. And so we approach all of our work with a fourfold diversity model as the foundation for all the other work. The fourfold stands for ideological diversity, generational, geographic, as well as race and ethnicity. So we're really making sure that we have a broad representation of Americans, of America itself, as we do the work. And then the next thing that we've done is we've hired a PR firm to help popularize and mainstream the stories of all the great work that our members do. So if we can start to capture the narrative or change the narrative or build a new narrative, however you want to language this, about how to have a healthy democracy and what actions citizens themselves can do, we think that's going to impact and make it easier, both the reform work that every one of our members does, but also it's going to give us a healthier place to live and reach that vision of a healthy, just society. To this end, we've also, as Jeff mentioned, I think in my opening, just purchased the Fulcrum, which is a news platform that covers specifically political reform. We're going to weave one of the changes that we're making to the Fulcrum. They've done a great job at the Fulcrum. They have laid a great foundation, but we saw this opportunity to really take this core of political reform and strengthening democracy and connect it to every other issue that's out there that people are passionate about that are stuck. So whether it's climate or healthcare or tax reform, whatever it is, all these issues get stuck because democracy itself is broken. So let's fix democracy first, and then we can take on everything else. Lastly, in next month, in mid-June, we're going to be launching a public-facing portal. This is like a one-stop shop for citizens to come and get connected up to whatever their passion is and start becoming part of the solution. So we're going to match citizens to each other to have those dialogues, and we're going to match citizens to organizations so they can get involved and become part of the solution. And of course, Bridge Alliance is like holding these pieces together right now and doing it in concert and in community with their members.
Great. No, thank you. We'll come back to some of that, but let me bring Layla into the conversation now too. Layla, Millennial Action Project has both legislators of the rising generation of new leaders. Tell us more about it. And as you take the leadership of the organization, share a little bit about where you want to see it go, what you all want to see as a much better way of doing things going forward in this country.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeff, and just thank you to America's Promise for having this conversation. For those who are not familiar with Millennial Action Project, we work to train a generation of young elected officials to build a more functional democracy. So we do that through helping them become bridge builders, helping train them on coalition building, and ultimately help them pass bipartisan legislation on, Debilyn, to your point, a variety of different issues, including the issue of democracy itself. And our theory of change is that if you can help people unite along generational lines instead of along partisan lines, then you can start to unlock a different framework of approaching problems that opens up just a whole new way of solving things. And not to say that one generation is better than the other. We would never, start any kind of generational warfare. But it is a really important starting point. And as you all know, the fastest growing political affiliation, right, is independent. And people are just not finding themselves satisfied with the binary of sort of the Democratic ideology and the Republican ideology. We're a lot more a la carte when it comes to issues and solving problems. I kind of think about it like the difference between Netflix and a cable package, right? Like young people my age, we're not buying cable packages anymore. It's just not something we want to pay for the entire thing if there's only one show we want. We're much more likely to maybe subscribe to like Netflix and Hulu, or maybe you're an Amazon Prime and a Disney Plus kind of person. And we're a lot more curated with how we think about sort of buying our television programming. I think our approach to issues and to problem solving is pretty similar. And I think that represents a pretty powerful opportunity to think about how we bring people together and how we start to sort of tackle things one by one instead of feeling like we have to check every box down a list and there's some sort of kind of purity test. I'll give one example of a story that I think represents sort of the MAP ethos. In 2017, we brought together the young state legislators in Mississippi to start the Mississippi Future Caucus. So young Democrats, young Republicans. We hosted them for a dinner. The first topic that comes up is we got to do something about the state flag. There is Confederate iconography on the state flag. We'd like to do something about it. And I'll tell you, half the people in that caucus said, absolutely not. If I even touch that issue with a 10-foot pole, I won't be here. I'm not working on that. And so we sustained a dialogue still among the Mississippi Future Caucus, working on issues like workforce development and student debt. And last summer, when the issue came up again, this group of young legislators had been working on building trust with each other over the course of 3 years. When the flashpoint again arose of, we got to do something about this state flag, the issue of race was no longer so impossible for this group to navigate because they had been doing the hard work of building the social cohesion and building the culture change within the legislature. that allowed them to respond. And ultimately, the Future Caucus worked together to unanimously vote to change the state flag. And I think that's one of many different examples. We've had progress on vote by mail last year. We worked with our legislators on that. We've worked on student debt. But a lot of it is just building that civic muscle so that when the reforms that Cheryl, that Scott are passing, there is a way to sustain the changes so that they don't get reversed, but that they really endure and become transformative in a way that leads us to sort of a higher order. And that's the work of MAP. And I think where I see it going is we're seeing more and more young people run for office. And I'm very encouraged with sort of the leaders taking their first steps into public service. Last cycle, we saw 266% increase in millennials running for office. And if that trend continues, and if MAP can continue to train them as they step into Congress, as they step into state legislatures, I think we're in a good place. I think our democracy is looking good.
Let me follow up on that, because we see a lot of that in American Promise too, because we have to bring conservatives, independents, progressives, Democrats, Republicans, independents together, not just nationally, but where we live, in our states, in our communities. And it can be hard, but I also have found people actually get a great deal out of it. There's a sense of reconnection, of building that trust, of actually learning. Compromise isn't always about like giving up. It's actually getting better because you appreciated a different way of doing it that you wouldn't have thought about before. Do you find that? How do your legislators feel about it when they go through this personally? Do they feel like this is a good thing? I want to do more of this?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think that you're totally right. Compromise isn't about watering down and ending up at something that everybody sort of hates. It's about picking the best elements of an idea and putting them together to create something that no one person would have come up with on their own. We see that on some of the big intractable issues that are impacting our generation that, I think the national media would maybe want us to think that there's just two options, the Democratic option and the Republican option, something like climate, something like investing in energy infrastructure. There's a lot of good ideas that are coming from both sides of the aisle that if we are going to create something that is really bold and innovative and considers sort of angles that you wouldn't have considered before, you need to be talking to as many different people as possible. And I think young people get that. And the problem is our legislatures and our political system is not set up to incentivize engaging across those lines of difference. Even if you're, literally just a member of Congress, like you don't have time physically to meet people across the aisle sometimes. That infrastructure doesn't exist. And so they're really grateful, I think, to have an excuse, to have that permission structure, to have that reason to even make the relationship in the first place. And then the alchemy of what can happen after that is it can go in so many different directions.
Yeah. Well, I want to bring in some comments and questions from the chat. And again, if you're watching, you can simply join the conversation by typing in your question and your comment, and I'll be sure to bring it into the conversation. So Victoria has both a comment and a question, and it's about money in the system, but particularly in ballot initiatives. And so the comment is about including Alaskans for Better Elections, including the ranked choice voting ballot initiative in Massachusetts. Many of these had a lot of funding coming from elsewhere. And the question is about, does American Promise's constitutional amendment address ballot initiatives? The answer is yes, but I want to open up the conversation to that, plus how we think about, funding big reform, because it doesn't just happen. And so, one point of reference for when you're thinking about a ballot initiative is Uber and the shared ride and gig economy industry spent $200 million on a California ballot initiative to repeal California's reform labor laws about the gig economy and designation as an employee versus a contractor. We saw the big pharma spending over $150 million between California and Ohio combined. I remember looking at the Ohio one, and literally there was not $1 that came from an Ohio citizen into that ballot initiative to prevent drug price reform. So literally nobody in Ohio had the position that actually won, that had the multi-million-dollar fund. And so, the ballot initiatives that I mentioned had once been a great citizen reform, intended specifically to enable lawmaking by the people when the legislature had become corrupted or unduly influenced. And now we're seeing money impacting the ballot initiative too. So the constitutional amendment does address that. There is a court case holding that corporations as people and free speech have a right to spend unlimited money in ballot initiatives. Most Americans don't agree. We don't agree. The constitutional amendment fixes that. But Scott, I want to ask you, and put you on the spot a little bit, because there's a lot of money in the Massachusetts ranked choice voting, and it didn't really help. It lost here. And I'm a Massachusetts citizen. I voted for it. I was happy to support it. But Alaska, it seemed like you really engaged the people of Alaska too. It wasn't just about money. How do you think about funding reform? What is the balance between, the need to do big things with national organizations that are trying to get better rules and engaging the people where we live, so that it's not some sort of parachuted in reform coming from somewhere else?
Yeah, it really is a balance, because the one thing I learned, because, as you know, Jeff, because you were there from the early days, it was literally, me in a room typing up a ballot measure, and there was no money. There's not a real natural constituency to plug into for these kind of reforms. I shopped it around, and people said, well, that's great. Is it going to elect more Ds? Well, I said, no, it's going to result in better decision making and people getting elected who more people support. Same answer on the Republican side. Is it going to elect more Republicans? Well, no, it's meant to be nonpartisan. So no one's interested. So to some degree, you are at the whim of getting at least some outside support. We, as you said, Jeff, we started out very grassroots. We had hundreds of Alaska donors in a state as small as ours. It was a significant movement. And we built the relationships we needed. We got the Speaker of the House, Bryce Edgman. He was the first Alaska Native Speaker of the House. He endorsed it. We got we kind of went guerrilla warfare style and got local representatives, local mayors, local assembly people on board that represented their regions. We were, of course, opposed by sitting Governor Dunleavy. We were opposed by his opponent, or his former opponent, former Senator Mark Begich. So we had 95% of the vote for governor from the prior election saying vote no, and yet we still just kind of ground through. And yeah, at the end of the day, 90% of our money came from outside. We couldn't hide from that, because if we had the resources, we knew we had to win. But I will say, we neutralized that in a couple of ways. First of all, in most respects, that money didn't come into play until the last 6 or 8 weeks when you go up on TV, and that's when you spend all your money, of course. But the other thing we did, which I think was meaningful to folks, is we said, we're gonna act as though we live in the world we envision. So when we got money from one of the national groups, Unite America or other groups, we often actually went beyond disclosure and disclosed who their donors were. We said, you want to know where this money comes from? There are real individuals, real foundations behind this, and we will just give you every bit of information we have. And that seemed to resonate with folks. So it was, but there's no hiding from the sheer amount of money, sloshing around our elections. And to get these reforms through, we really had to make the decision: will we unilaterally disarm, or is accepting this money, the means to the much greater end? And Fortunately, it came out all right for us.
Well, American Promise has 22 states calling for this amendment. I got a I can't help share the story of 5 of them were by ballot initiative. And when we did it in Massachusetts, it created a citizen commission. Cheryl and I served on it with 15 other citizens of Massachusetts to move the amendment forward. And I remember a consultant, and as you know, Scott, there's sort of a political industrial complex out there with consultants who make a lot of money in this business. And he said, "Oh, Massachusetts price of admission is $9 million." And I said, "Well, that's interesting because we ain't got that." But we have 1,000 volunteers, and we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. We spent almost no money. They collected 140,000 signatures. That's 140,000 conversations, citizen to citizen. We won 72% of the vote. Now, that's hard to do. I'll tell you, it was hard. But it was also a testament, I think, to this issue where it wasn't necessarily a new way to vote, like ranked choice voting. It was something people already knew where they stood, and they wanted this. So there's a lot of different opportunities out there. I want to bring in Michael Horton's comment on the chat and question because we're running out of time. He says that, he's come to appreciate how much, even after an amendment or any of these big solutions, it doesn't end. Like, we have to pass local laws, state laws, basically forever. That's democracy, right? That we always, and some of what we're doing gives us the power to do it better, Michael. That's how I think about it. And so he's looking for objective, like, where do we find the best practices, the best laws that people should, recommend at the state or local level. And so I'm going to turn that question to you folks, with the caveat that where you find them is right here with these 4 people and Bridge Alliance and other places. But Cheryl, let me ask you, and we just have a minute or two. Where do you look for? What's the best voting rights law? What's the most important work to move forward, and how do we find those those best practices?
So one of the best pieces of legislation that we can pass and move forward, particularly here in Massachusetts, is same-day registration. We're always looking to make it accessible to everybody, and I believe that is the true stopgap. Is having that one piece along with automatic voter reg and all the other pieces that we've already put in place. But same-day registration is one of the pieces of we're going to be working on really diligently. That was on our agenda last year. Then COVID came up, so we had to pivot to make sure that we had, the safe elections piece of legislation that extended early voting that we're fighting for now to make it permanent. But right now, honestly, Jeff, what comes right now is defending our voting rights. Is of the utmost important and concern right now. We have so many pieces of legislation that came out. All of a sudden, we have several pieces of legislation that's walking us backwards. And that's unfortunate, and I think, unfortunately, those that didn't like the outcome of the election want to prevent a similar outcome from occurring again. And so they're peeling back these pieces of legislation instead of us advancing. But you know what? We still have to keep advancing. My same-day registration.
Right.
We need to get it done.
Thank you. And Layla, just a minute or so. What do your state legislators look for model reforms? Do you have a database? Yeah. Do you send them somewhere? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I would say just a really good, very nonpartisan one is NCSL, which is the National Conference of State Legislatures. And they just track literally every issue, every sort of bill, and it's organized that way. So you can be pretty sure you're not getting biased information. I would say from our perspective, young legislators are interested in modernizing the whole process, right? Like, we should be able to register to vote online. You should be able to track your ballot online if you mail it in. Like, we should be bringing our systems into the 21st century. And I think in terms of reforms, those are the types of things that really energize our network.
Yeah, great. Debilyn, we're going to give you the last word with a plug for the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers as a place for trusted information about reform.
Yeah, I was just thinking, this is a call for a repository of drafted legislation that local legislators could pick and use. And I think the nonpartisan reformers are the place to do that. You know, the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, or NANNER, as we like to say. And so I'm gonna like give them a task, if you will, and we'll talk about it at the next board meeting, Jeff. Great.
Well, thank you to all of you for your amazing work, your inspiration. Thanks to all for joining us tonight. And make sure to come back Thursday evening for another day 2 of this conference. Layla, Debilyn, Cheryl, Scott, thanks for everything, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.